For decades, the desert of Chihuahua concealed much more than sand and scorching heat. It hid secrets. Planes loaded with cocaine landing under the cover of darkness, hitmen armed like private armies, corrupt officials protecting an invisible enemy. And at the center of it all, a surname that inspired fear on both sides of the border: Carrillo Fuentes. Today, more than a decade after the capture of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, known as El Viceroy, the legacy of the Juárez Cartel still echoes like a blood-stained shadow in the streets of Mexico. His brother, Amado Carrillo Fuentes, nicknamed the Lord of the Skies, not only redefined drug trafficking, he industrialized it. Together, they forged an empire that moved more than $300 million per week, controlling routes, territories, institutions, and at times, even local politics. But their story is not only a chronicle of power, it is a story of betrayal, war, and death. The mystery surrounding Amado's death during a cosmetic surgery triggered an internal struggle that transformed Ciudad Juárez into the most violent city on the planet. And while homicide rates skyrocketed, El Viceroy resisted extradition, accumulating years in Mexican prisons. Until now. Because for the first time in his life, Vicente faces a fate he never imagined: the death penalty in the United States, accused of terrorism. This is the story of a criminal empire. A story written with dollars, bullets, and corpses. A story that, even today, has not ended. Located on Mexico's northern border, Ciudad Juárez has been, since the mid-20th century, one of the main corridors of organized crime in Latin America. Its proximity to El Paso, Texas, and its strategic position between two oceans made it a key point for smuggling first of goods, later of drugs, weapons, and human beings. Before the rise of the Carrillo Fuentes family, other names already echoed within the criminal ecosystem of northern Mexico. Men like Pablo Acosta Villarreal, known as the Fox of Ojinaga, were among the first to understand the geopolitical value of the region, alongside figures such as Gilberto Ontiveros, El Greñas, Rafael Aguilar Guajardo, and the Muñoz Talavera brothers. They laid the foundations for what would later become a sophisticated transnational trafficking network. Those pioneers established routes, bribed authorities, and forged links with Colombian cartels decades before the DEA could even grasp the magnitude of the problem. But the true turning point came with a name that would mark the history of Mexican drug trafficking: Ernesto Fonseca Carrillo, alias Don Neto. Under his leadership, the emerging cartel underwent a period of rapid expansion, becoming a key node in the flow of drugs toward the United States. However, everything changed in 1985, when his involvement in the brutal murder of DEA agent Enrique Kiki Camarena led to his imprisonment, unleashing an unprecedented storm. The power vacuum created by his fall did not last long. From the shadows, his nephews Amado and Vicente Carrillo Fuentes took control of the organization, and what had been a regional smuggling group transformed into one of the most lethal and organized criminal structures in the Western Hemisphere. During the late 1980s and throughout the 1990s, the Carrillo Fuentes brothers wove a web of power that came to dominate nearly all drug trafficking in Mexico. Under their command, the Juárez Cartel ceased to be a border organization and became a continental force. The key to this meteoric rise was not only violence or corruption, it was the strategic vision of Amado Carrillo Fuentes. The eldest brother understood, before anyone else, the value of transnational alliances. First with the Medellín Cartel, led by Pablo Escobar, then with the Cali Cartel after Escobar's downfall, and later with the North Valley Cartel. These connections with Colombia's major organizations allowed him access to unprecedented quantities of cocaine at Mexico's northern border, and guaranteed stable routes toward the largest consumer market in the world, the United States. While Amado designed the business model with surgical precision, his brother Vicente played the role of enforcer and operator. The combination of strategic intelligence and operational brutality turned the Juárez Cartel into the most powerful criminal organization in the country. It was in this context that Amado conceived an idea that would forever transform drug trafficking. While other organizations continued to use land routes, tunnels, or speedboats, he designed an industrial-scale logistics system, a fleet of aircraft dedicated exclusively to transporting cocaine from Colombia to Mexico and from there into the United States. This innovation would earn him his ultimate nickname, the Lord of the Skies. The impact was immediate. According to DEA estimates, at its peak, the Juárez Cartel generated between $200 and $300 million weekly. Of that total, roughly 1% was allocated to bribes, an essential mechanism, ensuring the operational flow of the business. But Amado was not a traditional drug lord. Unlike others who flaunted their wealth, he maintained a low profile. He avoided the media, shunned visible luxury, and limited his public appearances. His inner circle was protected by a select group of hitmen, whose sole mission was to preserve his anonymity and eliminate any informational threats. Journalists who got too close to the truth often disappeared without a trace. This secrecy explains why most of what is known about his operation comes from U.S. intelligence sources, rather than local investigations. More than just a drug trafficker, Amado Carrillo was a crime entrepreneur. His operations were governed by a corporate logic. The Juárez Cartel functioned like a multinational company. There were clear hierarchies, functional specialization, quality control, and a disciplined structure that left no room for error. That combination of vision, discretion, and ruthless efficiency was the formula that made the Juárez Cartel the dominant force in Mexican drug trafficking for over a decade. But every empire, even those built with dollars and rifles, has a breaking point. And Amado's was drawing near. Yet not even empires built with surgical precision are immune to collapse. On the 4th of July 1997, in Mexico City, Amado Carrillo Fuentes discreetly entered a private clinic. His objective: to undergo cosmetic surgery that would radically alter his face. The pressure from both Mexican and U.S. authorities was mounting, and changing his appearance had become, for him, a matter of survival. The operation lasted 8 hours. According to official reports, the procedure concluded without complications. However, in the hours that followed, something went wrong. Amado began to experience acute pain. He was given a high dose of sedatives and never woke up again. The official version states that he died from an adverse reaction to anesthesia. But to this day, his death remains shrouded in mystery. Some claim he faked his death as part of an elaborate plan to disappear from the radar. Others assert he was the victim of an internal power play. The truth is that, after that event, the Juárez Cartel was left without its architect and without its most feared leader. The void Amado left behind was immense. His empire, worth billions of dollars, was at stake. The organization possessed a complex structure, dozens of routes, international connections, a network of institutional protection, and a bloody legacy. He also left behind 28 children and an uncertain line of succession. The Juárez Cartel stood at a crossroads that would define its fate. Adapt to a new era of violence and competition, or collapse under its own weight. Succession became a matter of state within the criminal underworld. Among the possible heirs was Vicente Carrillo Leiva, Amado's son, but his youth and lack of experience disqualified him. Another candidate was Juan José Álvarez Tostado, godfather and financial administrator of the Lord of the Skies. But his closeness to Ismael El Mayo Zambada generated tension. It was then that a figure respected in all circles of the drug world intervened: Juan José Esparragoza Moreno, known as El Azul. Aware of the danger of an internal fracture, he proposed the creation of a council to appoint the new leader. The final decision fell on Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, Amado's brother, nicknamed El Viceroy. His appointment was not the result of merit or widespread respect, but of political calculation. Within the cartel, Vicente was seen as a manageable figure, someone who could be easily influenced by the true power brokers behind the scenes. But that assessment underestimated Vicente's character. Unlike his brother, who was cold, patient, and strategic, El Viceroy was impulsive, temperamental, and prone to visceral decisions. While Amado cultivated alliances, Vicente enforced obedience through fear. Where one moved with stealth, the other exploded with violence. The choice of Vicente marked the beginning of a new era for the Juárez Cartel, one in which discretion gave way to open confrontation, and the diplomacy of crime was replaced by chaos. Under his command, the decline began almost immediately. After taking over leadership of the Juárez Cartel, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes faced a fragmented and tension-filled landscape. One of his first strategic decisions was to claim Sinaloa as part of his zone of influence, immediately triggering conflict with Ismael El Mayo Zambada, who considered that territory his own and non-negotiable. At the same time, Vicente Carrillo Leiva, Amado's son, distanced himself from his uncle. The differences were both personal and operational. This internal rift further weakened the cartel's cohesion. Only Arturo Beltrán Leiva, known as El Barbas, remained firmly loyal to Vicente, supporting his leadership amid an increasingly volatile environment. Although respected figures such as El Mayo and El Azul maintained formal relations with El Viceroy, they shared a common assessment. Vicente lacked the vision and composure to hold together the cartel's complex network. His aggressive and erratic style distanced him from the model of leadership that had defined his brother. Meanwhile, other criminal organizations began to fill the void. The Arellano Félix cartel in Tijuana expanded its power, displacing Juárez from the national dominance it had enjoyed during Amado's reign. The hardest blow would come in 2001. That year, Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán carried out a spectacular escape from Puente Grande prison. His breakout changed the rules of the game. With his return to the field, numerous Juárez Cartel operatives defected and joined the Pacific Organization, drawn by El Chapo's growing power, structure, and promises. Despite these setbacks, Vicente managed to maintain control of Ciudad Juárez. His ability to keep operations running allowed the cartel to continue generating enormous profits. In its best years, revenues surpassed $1 billion annually. But that stability was fragile. Everything would change in 2004. On September 11 of that year, in Culiacán, Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, nicknamed El Niño de Oro and younger brother of Amado and Vicente, was gunned down along with his partner, Giovanna Quevedo, as they left a movie theater. The attack was ordered by El Chapo Guzmán, and although the exact motive remains disputed, it is believed to have been driven by an act of disrespect. Rodolfo allegedly refused to shake El Chapo's hand during a meeting. In the world of drug trafficking, the perception of disloyalty is paid for in blood. The execution of El Niño de Oro was the spark that ignited a conflict of unprecedented proportions. What had until then been a hidden war became an open and brutal confrontation between the Juárez Cartel and the Sinaloa Cartel. Ciudad Juárez, once a symbol of the Carrillo family's power, became the main stage of violence. To understand the scale of that war, it is necessary to understand how the Juárez Cartel operated at its peak. The organization functioned under a rigid, almost military hierarchy. At the top was Vicente, surrounded by lieutenants who controlled specific zones known as plazas. Each plaza had a regional chief who reported directly to the leadership. This model allowed for vertical control of the business and a rapid response to local threats. At the same time, the cartel maintained a sophisticated financial structure, responsible for managing capital, laundering money through front companies, and distributing profits among its members. This economic architecture not only sustained the wealth of the leadership, but also ensured continuous funding for its war machine. The operational muscle consisted of several armed branches. The main one was La Línea, a strike group of around 1,000 men whose mission was to defend the cartel's territories. However, the true military elite was represented by Los Linces. Founded by Luis Francisco Flores Estebané, Los Linces were a specialized unit made up of former members of Mexico's Special Forces. According to intelligence reports, they once had up to 340 highly trained operatives organized into small cells of up to 5 members. These commandos operated with military discipline, tactical mobility, and a lethal capability unprecedented in Mexico's organized crime scene. Their arsenal included assault rifles, Barrett sniper rifles, submachine guns, shotguns, grenades, and advanced communication technology. They were invisible, precise, and absolutely lethal. And they were ready for war. The level of operational sophistication of Los Linces far surpassed that of any other armed criminal group at the time. Their specialized training and military discipline made them an elite unit, designed to execute missions with relentless efficiency. They were silent, meticulous, invisible, and deadly. Their arsenal included weaponry reserved almost exclusively for military forces, AR-15 assault rifles, Tech-9 submachine guns, Barrett, 50 caliber sniper rifles, combat shotguns, and fragmentation grenades. Possessing such equipment placed Los Linces on a higher level, not only compared to rival groups, but even against the state's own security forces. The key to their effectiveness lay not only in their firepower, but in their absolute discretion. They acted only under direct orders from the cartel's leadership, and their identities were unknown even to other members of the organization. Their operational independence instilled fear even within their own ranks. No one wanted to cross paths with a lince. No one. The victims of these hitmen were not only rival traffickers. Their targets also included state officials, mayors, municipal presidents, police officers, and journalists. Anyone who posed a threat, real or perceived, was a legitimate target. The cartel's military arm operated with precision, but its most effective shield was not its rifles, it was its network of institutional corruption. From municipal patrol officers to high-ranking officials in state and federal agencies, the Juárez Cartel managed to infiltrate the very institutions meant to fight it. Judges, politicians, and agents were all part of its secret payroll. Bribes were a structural component of the operation. Calculated as a fixed percentage of income around 1%, they were recorded as just another business expense, a necessary cost to ensure impunity, loyalty, and silence. This seemingly perfect machine was about to face its most brutal challenge yet, a total war against the Sinaloa Cartel. The rivalry between Vicente Carrillo Fuentes and Joaquín El Chapo Guzmán was nothing new. But the murder of Rodolfo Carrillo Fuentes, El Niño de Oro, marked a point of no return. It was then that Vicente reached out to Ismael El Mayo Zambada in an attempt to define sides. "Are you with me or are you against me?" asked Carrillo. El Mayo replied that he was on his side. But when Vicente demanded that he hand over El Chapo, he received only silence. That silence was the confirmation. The war had begun. The response did not take long. On the 31st of December 2004, Arturo Guzmán Loera, alias El Pollo, and brother of El Chapo, was murdered inside the Altiplano Federal Maximum Security Prison. All eyes turned to Vicente Carrillo as the mastermind behind the crime. It was a personal, direct, and symbolic blow. With this act of vengeance, 2005 began with both organizations in open war. El Viceroy mobilized all his available resources. He reinforced La Línea, his historical armed wing, and strengthened his alliance with Barrio Azteca, a binational gang with strong presence in El Paso and Ciudad Juárez. But even these combined forces were not enough against the rising power of the Sinaloa Cartel. Guzmán and Zambada not only had unlimited resources, but also a network of alliances that Vicente never managed to build. For a brief period, the conflict slowed when the Sinaloans focused their attention on a new war, the confrontation with the Gulf Cartel. It was the perfect opportunity for Carrillo to reorganize, forge new alliances, or strengthen his defenses. But he didn't. He squandered the moment. And that strategic omission would have irreversible consequences. Because the worst was yet to come. By 2007, the war already consuming Ciudad Juárez reached a new level of complexity. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, who until then had been waging a bloody battle against the Sinaloa Cartel, found himself facing a second enemy, The Gulf Cartel. The simultaneous confrontation with two of the most powerful criminal organizations in the country became an unsustainable burden. The result was devastating. Ciudad Juárez, once a symbol of the absolute dominance of the Carrillo Fuentes family, became the most violent city in the world. During the most intense years of the conflict, more than 8,000 violent homicides were recorded, many displaying levels of brutality that bordered on the inhuman. In just the first 3 months of 2008, more than 200 people were executed. The numbers spoke for themselves, but they did not capture the daily terror that filled the streets. Shootouts in broad daylight, indiscriminate kidnappings, decapitations, messages written in blood. Violence stopped being the exception, it became the routine. Amid the collapse of order, the government of then-President Felipe Calderón launched a series of military operations in the area as part of his national strategy against drug trafficking. However, multiple reports indicated that these interventions indirectly favored the Sinaloa Cartel. The widespread perception was that the state forces applied selective pressure, weakening El Chapo Guzman's enemies and allowing his organization to consolidate. Juárez lived in a state of war. The civilian population was trapped between crossfire. Everyday life was transformed by fear. Businesses closed at sunset, parents avoided taking their children to school, and public events were indefinitely cancelled. The local economy collapsed, tourism vanished, and thousands of residents fled the city. Public institutions were overwhelmed. Police officers resigned en masse for fear of being executed, or, in many cases, ended up joining one side or the other. Hospitals operated under conditions typical of a war zone, treating the wounded without rest. Schools suspended classes constantly due to nearby shootings or bomb threats. This spiral of horror marked the beginning of the end for the Juárez Cartel. While the Sinaloa Cartel expanded its control over routes, territories, and institutions, Vicente Carrillo's power eroded rapidly. His authority was no longer feared as before. His network of allies began to fracture. In that context, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes made a decision that many interpreted as a definitive retreat. He abandoned Ciudad Juárez and the state of Chihuahua, relocating his operations to Torreón, Coahuila. That move confirmed what was already evident to all. El Viceroy had lost control of his historic stronghold. But Carrillo was not willing to surrender. From his new refuge, he sought to keep the resistance alive through strategic alliances, particularly with the Beltrán Leiva and Los Zetas, two equally violent organizations determined to confront Guzmán. His strongest bond was with Arturo Beltrán Leiva, alias El Barbas. Both men shared similar traits: explosive temperaments, a taste for violence as a means of control, and a deep hatred for El Chapo. That personal affinity evolved into an operational alliance that sustained Carrillo during his final years of criminal activity. However, that relationship would end abruptly in December 2009, when Arturo Beltrán was killed in a Mexican Navy operation in Cuernavaca. His death meant more than the fall of a drug lord. It was the collapse of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes' last major support. Without powerful allies, with his structure weakened and his territory lost, El Viceroy faced an inevitable future. After the fall of Arturo Beltrán Leiva, rumors spread that the Sinaloa Cartel had sent envoys to Vicente Carrillo Fuentes with a high-level proposal: a truce. The offer included not only a ceasefire but also the possibility of reintegrating him into certain joint operations. But Vicente refused. The memory of his brother Rodolfo's murder, El Niño de Oro, was still an open wound. For El Viceroy, no economic gain could justify forgetting that offense. The personal hatred he felt toward Joaquín Guzmán Loera outweighed any strategic calculation. For him, the war was no longer about territorial control. It was about revenge. Furthermore, Héctor Beltrán Leiva, brother of the fallen Arturo, had assumed control of his organization and kept the alliance with Carrillo Fuentes alive. Both shared losses, resentments, and enemies. The resistance persisted for a while longer, uniting the remaining fragments of both cartels in a desperate offensive against Sinaloa's power. But reality was different. The combined pressure of two unstoppable forces, the Mexican government and the Sinaloa Cartel, ultimately suffocated their enemies. The Beltrán Leiva organization, despite its violence and resources, could not withstand the onslaught. Héctor Beltrán would also fall, following the same fate as his brother and his ally. And then came the turn of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes. On the 9th of October 2014, after months of intelligence operations, El Viceroy was captured in Torreón, Coahuila. The operation, carried out without a single shot, was silent and surgical. But the most revealing detail was the scene the agents encountered. Vicente was traveling with only one bodyguard, in an unarmored vehicle. No convoy, no bulletproof vest, no heavy weapons. The man who, a decade earlier, had unleashed a war of historic proportions looked unrecognizable. He had undergone cosmetic surgeries to alter his face, making identification difficult. In the preceding months, authorities had tracked him discreetly, cross-checking biometric data, tracing financial movements, and analyzing encrypted communications. When they finally confirmed his identity, they arrested him without resistance. Vicente did not fight back or show aggression. His demeanor was different, silent, resigned, almost apathetic. That image, captured by official cameras, stood in stark contrast to the fierce drug lord who had turned Ciudad Juárez into a war zone. No trace remained of the enraged commander who once defied two of the country's most powerful cartels. All that was left was a lonely, aged, and defeated man. Although an extradition order to the United States existed, the process was postponed. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was tried in Mexico, where in 2021 he received a 28-year prison sentence for drug trafficking and money laundering. Everything suggested that his story would end there, that the last high-ranking boss of the Juárez Cartel would spend his final days in a cell, far from the myth of his brother Amado, yet burdened with a far darker and bloodier legacy. What no one imagined was that there was still one final, unexpected, and consequential chapter left for the man who had once ruled the most dangerous border in the world. After Vicente Carrillo Fuentes' fall, control of the decaying Juárez Cartel passed to Juan Pablo Ledesma, alias JL. This change marked the beginning of a new era for the organization, one without glory, focused not on territorial dominance, but on operational survival. Unlike his predecessors, Ledesma did not belong to the Carrillo dynasty. He was no heir of bloodline, but rather a product of the base. He had risen from field operations, consolidating himself as the leader of La Línea, the armored wing that endured the worst years of the war against the Sinaloa Cartel. His operational background gave him a different perspective. While the Carrillos ruled from the top with a vertical and personalist logic, Ledesma understood the reality on the ground. He pursued a more pragmatic, less symbolic strategy, abandoning revenge-driven conflicts rooted in family honor. His priority was to keep the organization alive, even if it meant sacrificing its old identity. Under his leadership, La Línea began to evolve. It went from being a paramilitary force subordinate to the cartel to becoming an almost independent structure, with its own operations, internal hierarchies, and strategic autonomy. Although still associated with the historic name of the Juárez Cartel, in practice, it had become a different organization altogether. This transition was accompanied by territorial fragmentation. La Línea maintained a presence in various regions of the state of Chihuahua, but in a decentralized manner. In Ciudad Juárez, control rested in the hands of César Manjarres Alonso, alias El H2. In the Namiquipa region, dominance belonged to Gustavo Chávez Villa, known as El Master. The absence of a strong central command encouraged the emergence of new subgroups. In 2018, a cell identified as Los Escorpiones appeared, tasked with patrolling specific areas of Ciudad Juárez and accused of participating in executions, shootouts, and police assassinations. This internal fragmentation, far from strengthening the structure, weakened it. The new configuration was more horizontal and less hierarchical than in the days of Amado or Vicente. Each regional leader operated with relative independence, which led to tension, competition for resources, and a loss of cohesion. The crisis was nothing new. Since 2010, the cartel had suffered consecutive blows in clashes with Los Zetas and the Beltrán Leiva organization, its former allies. The loss of strategic routes, the exhaustion of prolonged warfare, and the exodus of hitmen to rival groups steadily eroded its power. Many of the operatives who once served the Juárez Cartel ended up joining Sinaloa, La Familia Michoacana, or simply acting as mercenaries for the highest bidder. Collapse seemed inevitable. It was in this context of weakness that Ledesma made a decision that surprised even his own men. In 2017, he struck an alliance with the Jalisco New Generation Cartel, CJNG. The agreement was clear: hand over to the CJNG control of illicit operations in Chihuahua, in exchange for protection, weapons, resources, and military support. With this move, the balance of criminal power in the state changed radically. For the first time in decades, the Juárez Cartel ceased to be the main actor in its own territory, yielding dominance to an external force with an expansionist vision and a brutality as methodical as it was relentless. The alliance between La Línea and the Jalisco New Generation Cartel radically altered the criminal landscape in Chihuahua. From that moment on, the CJNG became the dominant force in the region, absorbing routes, resources, and structures that had once been under the absolute control of the Juárez Cartel. But this new balance of power did not bring peace. According to intelligence reports from Mexican and U.S. agencies, the territorial reconfiguration not only failed to reduce violence, it intensified clashes between rival groups and internal factions. On the 4th of April 2020, in the mountainous region of Madera municipality, one of the bloodiest episodes of the decade unfolded. That day, hitmen from La Línea confronted armed men linked to an operator known as El Jaguar, an emerging figure in northern Mexico's criminal world. The outcome was brutal. At least 19 dead, dozens of abandoned vehicles, some burned, and 19 long guns seized, along with a single handgun. The scene found by authorities resembled a battlefield in the heart of the Chihuahua Mountains. That confrontation was not an isolated event. It formed part of a wave of violence that, in less than 24 hours, left 35 homicides across the state. Chihuahua, once again, was bleeding between old conflicts and new ambitions. Meanwhile, far from the roar of gunfire, another chapter unfolded in silence. The prison fate of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the man who had once commanded that entire empire. Since his capture in 2014, Carrillo Fuentes had remained imprisoned in Mexico, serving a 28-year sentence for drug trafficking and related crimes. But his legal situation was more complex than it appeared. Despite an extradition order issued by the Federal Court of the Western District of Texas, Vicente managed to block the process for years through a chain of injunctions, legal appeals, and delaying strategies. In September of the previous year, he had even obtained a final suspension, which seemed to guarantee his stay in Mexican territory. But on November 21, a federal judge overturned the injunction, reopening the door for the Mexican Ministry of Foreign Affairs to resume the extradition procedure. For Carrillo, it was a devastating blow. The threat of being handed over to the United States became an imminent reality. And it was not just any trial. The charges against him included murder, large-scale drug trafficking, and money laundering crimes that placed him among the world's most wanted criminals. The FBI had offered a $5 million reward for information leading to his capture. In Mexico, the then PGR had posted a 30 million peso reward. Vicente Carrillo was not an ordinary inmate. He was an emblematic figure of transnational crime. For years, his defense had managed to postpone the inevitable. But in February 2025, the process took an unexpected turn. On February 27, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes was transferred to the United States, along with Rafael Caro Quintero and 27 other high-profile Mexican drug lords. But what surprised everyone was not the extradition itself. It was the way it was carried out. The operation was officially described as an expulsion, not a traditional extradition. The distinction was not minor. while extradition involves a judicial process with guarantees and limits, such as the prohibition of the death penalty. Expulsion is based on administrative provisions and can bypass those commitments. The U.S. Department of Justice and the Department of State, in coordination with Mexico's Attorney General's Office, FGRA, defended the action as an exceptional measure under Mexico's national security law. The argument was that the expelled individuals represented a direct threat to the national security. That legal nuance opened the door for the first time in decades for a Mexican drug trafficker to potentially face the death penalty on U.S. soil. Vicente Carrillo Fuentes, the man who had defied his enemies until the end, was about to face his most feared trial, and this time, he no longer had the power to negotiate. On February 28, Vicente Carrillo Fuentes appeared before the federal court for the Eastern District of New York. In the courtroom, Judge Robert M. Levy posed a direct question that resonated powerfully. Can you explain the difference between expulsion and extradition? The prosecution responded with a technical explanation, but one with profound implications. They stated that the defendants, including Carrillo Fuentes, had not been formally extradited, but expelled under the terms of Mexico's national security law, with the explicit consent of the Mexican government. This procedure bypassed the legal restrictions of a traditional extradition, meaning that Vicente was not protected from the possibility of receiving the death penalty. A subtle difference in legal terms, but one immense in its consequences. The Viceroy's legal situation grew even darker due to two additional factors that shifted the international legal landscape. First, the Trump administration had recently designated Mexican cartels as foreign terrorist organizations. Second, the U.S. Department of Justice had declared that the fentanyl overdose epidemic constituted a terrorist act, orchestrated by the leaders of the criminal organizations trafficking the substance. Under this new framework, Carrillo Fuentes was no longer seen merely as a drug trafficker in the eyes of U.S. justice. He was now an alleged international terrorist. In his first formal hearing, Vicente pleaded not guilty to the charges against him: membership in a criminal organization and massive cocaine distribution on U.S. territory. The court scheduled his preliminary hearing for March 25, as the international press and organized crime analysts closely observed what could be the final chapter in the history of the Juárez Cartel, a story that, for nearly 3 decades, irreversibly transformed not only the landscape of Mexican drug trafficking, but also the lives of millions along the northern border. The human cost of its internal wars, corrupt pacts, and strategies of domination is incalculable. Although official figures speak of thousands of deaths directly linked to its criminal activity, the reality runs much deeper. Ciudad Juárez, the epicenter of the Carrillo Empire, underwent a traumatic transformation. Once an industrial city on the rise, promising economic growth due to its proximity to the United States, it became the most dangerous city on the planet. During the height of its conflict with the Sinaloa Cartel, between 2008 and 2010, violence reached historic levels. Over 8,000 homicides in less than 3 years, many executed with calculated brutality as a message of terror. The impact was devastating. The streets were scarred by clashes. Abandoned businesses, entire neighborhoods emptied, homes fortified with bars, cameras, and walls. Urban architecture itself began to reflect fear as a way of life. But even deeper were the invisible wounds. A generation of children and young people in Juarez grew up among corpses, military patrols, and self-imposed curfews. Death became part of daily life. And that normalization of horror left an indelible mark. The cultural impact of the cartel transcended its criminal operations. The songs, stories, symbols, and codes that emerged from its history became part of border folklore, distorting the identity of a city still struggling to rebuild itself. Because when a criminal empire falls, its debris does not disappear. It simply scatters among memory, politics, and blood. Over the years, the Juárez Cartel left a mark that transcended bullets, money, and corpses. Its influence permeated popular culture, shaping expressions, narratives, and even identities. The narcocorridos that glorified the Carrillo Fuentes became part of regional folklore. Television series and films took their story as inspiration, mythologizing their lives and deaths, blurring the line between reality and fiction. The language of drug trafficking infiltrated everyday speech. Aesthetic codes and attitudes associated with the criminal world began to influence younger generations. What was once a hermetic criminal structure ended up seeping into the behavior and worldview of thousands of young people exposed to its narrative. Today, the Juárez Cartel no longer exists as such. What remains of that once mighty organization is merely a shadow of its former power. After the alliance with the CJNG in 2017, the criminal landscape in Chihuahua was profoundly reconfigured. The Jalisco Cartel assumed strategic control, while scattered cells of La Línea continued to operate in different areas of the state, often without coordination among themselves. The capture of key figures such as Luis Gerardo, El Tío, former chief enforcer of La Línea, and accused of nearly 900 homicides, reflects the government's efforts to dismantle the last remnants of the Carrillo apparatus. Even so, violence persists. The clash that occurred in April 2020, with 19 gunmen killed in the mountains, demonstrated that the conflict has not ended. It has merely changed its face. The story of Vicente Carrillo Fuentes embodies a fundamental paradox of contemporary drug trafficking. Criminal empires, no matter how sophisticated or feared, always fall. But the structures they built rarely disappear completely. They fragment, adapt, and resurface under new names and new faces. While the Viceroy faces the possibility of a death sentence in the United States, his legacy remains engraved not only in court records or homicide statistics, but in the profound transformation of organized crime in Mexico. The story of the Juárez Cartel is not merely the chronicle of a criminal organization. It is the story of how drug trafficking reconfigured the social, economic, and political fabric of an entire region. A story written in blood, silence, and power that even today continues to shape the destiny of the northern border. Thank you for joining us in this extensive and well-documented journey through the history of the Juárez Cartel. If you value rigorous research, in-depth analysis, and stories that reveal the most complex side of organized crime, we invite you to subscribe to the channel. Activate the notification bell so you don't miss our upcoming documentaries. And share your thoughts in the comments. Which part impacted you the most? Which figure from the criminal world should we investigate in depth in the next episode? Your voice is essential to continue building an informed, critical, and engaged community, committed to understanding the phenomenon of organized crime beyond the myth. See you in the next video.